Inequality going from bad to worse. Oxfam says the gap between rich and poor has widened dramatically, with the super rich owning too much. So can the wealth gap be closed so we all get a fairer slice of the pie? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. 7 billion people in the world. Just 62 of them own as much wealth as the poorest half of the population. Oxfam says inequality around the world is worse than it has been in 100 years. The richest 1% already own more than the other 99% combined. In the past 5 years, the 62 wealthiest people have become 44% richer. Meanwhile, the poorest half of the world has become that much poorer. And the wealth gap is leading to a trust gap. The PR firm Edelman says growing income inequality has led to a rising sense of insecurity, and many no longer have faith in companies or politicians. Well, leaders from around the world are headed to Davos in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum to address some of these concerns. But what can they do? Well, Oxfam suggests new policies that clamp down on tax dodging by rich corporations and people, introduce sustainable minimum wages for all workers, give women equal pay, and invest in universal free health and education. Let's bring our guests into the chat now. In London, Hilary, Executive Director of War on Want. In Geneva, Jyrki, Raina, General Secretary of IndustriALL Global Union. And also in London is Randolph, Director of Sovereign Risk Analysis at IHS Global Insight. Welcome to you all. If we could start with John, what has caused the situation we're facing today where just 62 people, we're told, own as much as half of the world?
Well, it's no accident. I think this is the direct result of a series of policies which have been put in place over the last 20, 30 years, which have said we want to transfer not just wealth, but power to the smallest number of people, the richest elite. And it's exactly those
Which
people
policies are you talking
who are now
about, John?
meeting in Davos. We're talking of policies on trade, on investment, on international tax rules. The policies which basically say that if you're a big business, you have the right to operate almost free of any constraints around the world. Whereas if you're a poorer country or indeed a poor community, you have no chance at all for the future. And it's that concentration of power and wealth which is really at the heart of this problem.
Interesting. Who do you blame, John? The politicians, or some people say the politicians are not as powerful anymore as the companies?
I think the politicians are absolutely to blame because they're the ones who have willingly given up these powers to big business. If you look at the World Economic Forum in Davos, it's all the top politicians who are wined and dined by the big businesses. So it's no sense that they're the victims in this case. They're the ones who've willingly handed over our rights as ordinary people to these big businesses who can operate now almost free of any constraints.
Jan, do you agree with that analysis? Listening to John, what he's basically saying sounds to me when he talks about everything from trade to the politicians, the neoliberal economic model has failed the world.
Well, I think it depends where you measure things from. I think if we're talking about those 62 wealthiest, then certainly I think the income gap or the wealth gap has increased. And that's really down to the fact that they own stocks and shares, and they've been boosted by all this quantitative easing and monetary policy over the last 10 years because of the financial crisis, whereas the poorest haven't had that benefit at all. And average wages have basically gone nowhere, even in the US. I think when it comes to capitalism, I think it depends how you look at it. I think capitalism in China has lifted more people out of poverty than probably any country in the world in a very short space of time, including British Empire. That's a positive. I think the issue, the critique really is about global capitalism, the fact that banks and corporates can run circles around governments. Governments don't have the kind of comprehensive oversight and power they used to because companies and banks and money is fluid and global, and they can go wherever they want, the areas of least resistance, and it's often tax havens. I think the governments do have a responsibility of stepping up to the plate when it comes to loopholes, tax havens, and such like, to align their policies. And there have been attempts at that, G20. But again, it's only as strong as the weakest link and the weakest government here.
All right, you made some good points there. I do want to weigh in with Jan's take on this in a moment. But John, I want to bring up a point with you, which Jan mentioned there a moment ago. When you look at the reports by, for example, the World Bank, September 18th, 2015, John, it says, quote, since initiating market reforms in 1978, China has lifted more than 500 million people out of poverty. All Millennium Development Goals have either been reached or are within reach. When we talk about how trade policies, are the cause of the problem, is that correct in every country in the world? When you look at some places like China, the opposite argument is made, that it's precisely the move towards deregulation and free market policies which have helped people.
Well, I'm glad you've raised the issue of China. It's actually where I lived and worked in the 1980s, so I know quite a lot about those early reforms. Precisely at that time, when China decollectivized the agricultural sphere, so giving more power to the local peasants to be able to sell their own produce on open markets, that was the move which really got rid of hundreds of millions of people who were living in dire poverty. So for the World Bank to suggest that it's actually about China turning out to the world and embracing free market capitalism, that's a myth. China has held a very, very well-regulated, strongly controlled socialist market economy, trying to take some of the best bits from open markets, but also keeping strong state planning and state control. And that's how they've been successful. They can do that because they've got a strong centralized economy and a strong centralized planning system. That's not something which is open to the majority of countries.
All right, I do want to get Jyrki into the discussion, but bear with me, Jyrki, I just want Jan to come in with a brief comeback. Do you disagree with that when defenders of the free market and neoliberal model, hold up China, they're actually overlooking some of the detail?
I think what's been said about the benefits of the decollectivization and the peasants is correct, but it is not a myth that what the World Bank said about the opening up of China. Deng Xiaoping's reforms were cataclysmic in terms of the sea changes that we've seen. It opened up China to attract foreign direct investment. It created the industrial cities on the coast. It generated the movement of labor from, and we're still seeing it, the movement, population movements from the rural to the urban. That is all down to direct investment, foreign direct investment, capitalism, as you like, and the embracing of foreign capitalism, and the export engine that then drove the exports from China that we see made in China everywhere. Right. So it is not a myth. Made in China is very real, and we see it every day.
I'm sure John is going to want to come back in on this, but before we get into it, let me bring in Jyrki for a perspective of somebody who you represent, shall we say, the small and medium-sized industrialists and entrepreneurs around the world. Tell us what you see, the world that you see at their perspective, at their level of life. Has life got better or worse for them in the last decade or so?
Well, obviously, for some people, it has become better, but there are still hundreds of millions that are suffering with poverty wages. And I think one part of the story is that still in a majority of the world's countries, it is difficult to join a trade union or to set up a union. 60% of world's countries limit collective bargaining, and 70% they have limits on the right to strike. And that is why our unionization rate is only 7% in the world. And you know that in the new parts of the world, like Asia Pacific, they don't have this same tradition as in Europe in terms of social dialogue and building balanced societies. And that is why today the minimum wage in Bangladesh, where 4 million workers toil 60 hours a week and more at a minimum wage of $68 a month. Cambodia, $128 a month. This is where our clothes are made. This is what the industrial story of today is. So there is also, in addition to governments, there is a responsibility that lies with the multinational corporations and their supply chains, which are often bigger than the companies.
Do your members see that the reason for that some of those laws are not in place that you would like them to be there governing the minimum wage? Do they see because that's a result of the powerful having too much power, particularly the big corporations having too much influence on policy that governments set?
Our 50 million workers, they want to have more rights and better laws, but they also say that these big brands, the multinational corporations, they do have a responsibility. Take Coca-Cola. It has 130,000 workers of its own, but throughout the supply chain, they have 5.7 million workers. Gap has 150,000 workers, but in fact, million workers who produce the clothes of the Gap. So that is why we need to make this global supply chain responsibility a reality.
Isn't that happening, Jyrki? What do you make of the argument? I'm curious to know the trickle-down effect, that don't just look at how much richer the top rich are getting, the argument goes. Look at also how the poorer are moving into better wages, or from a situation of unemployment into some wages. The argument goes, surely some wages is better than zero.
Absolutely, it's better than zeros, but the multinational corporations can pay more. And that is why we have launched an initiative with a number of global garment brands, including H&M, Zara, and Tesco, to bring living wages to the workers through building national-level industrial collective bargaining structures. We're starting from Cambodia, moving to Ethiopia, Indonesia, and around the world. So we want to build a new industry structure, which I think is in line with what the world needs to do together today to build societies built on social justice.
All right, back to John. You know what the argument goes for those who believe in the neoliberal model? They say, isn't it better to have a world, John, where everyone is getting richer and people are moving out of poverty? Even if the rich are getting richer faster than everybody else, it's still better than a world where everyone's getting poorer or everyone's staying where they are when so many people are in poverty.
Well, of course, the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of people in the world are still living in grinding poverty as a direct result of the transfer of wealth and power to those at the top. And I do want to insist on this particular fact. It's not just an inequality of wealth, it's an inequality of power. And that goes to the heart of what we were discussing earlier. The trade rules and the investment rules which are in place around the world, they're not about stopping or starting trade. Trade's happening anyway. They talk about the terms under which big companies can trade and invest. So what conditions do we put on those big companies? What conditions do we put on the richest individuals? Do they have to pay tax, or do we just say to them, no? While we, ordinary people, have to pay tax, it's okay. The super rich can do without paying tax. They can just put all of their money in tax havens. When we say to big corporations, do you have to pay the living wage, or do you just leave it as a voluntary thing which you can choose to pay or to ignore as you like? And I think that's the big shift we need to make. We're no longer just asking, we're not begging from big corporations and from the richest individuals that they should be nice citizens and do the right thing. We're telling them these are the rules of the game, and you have to abide by those rules if you want to operate in our societies. All
right, well, for the sake of comparison, here are some of the wealthiest men in the world. Microsoft owner Bill Gates is the richest with almost $80 billion. That's about the same as the national budget of Malaysia, for example. Now, Mexican Tycom's tycoon Carlos Slim Helú could outspend Ireland. And New Zealand spends less every year than the personal wealth of Warren Buffett, the renowned US investor. Well, if those three men pooled their money together, we're told, and formed a country, its national budget would be the 39th biggest in the world. Who wouldn't want to be a citizen of that country? Jan, I guess listening to what John was saying there, perhaps what the world should be thinking about then is some new rules governing trade, perhaps moving in the opposite direction of deregulation. Do you oppose that?
I think more trade is better than less trade. If we look at history and we look at what's happened, trade and growth lift people out of poverty. And there will be generally winners. There's sometimes are losers. And I think that's where the protectionists come in with their arguments. We're open for more trade, but there may be losers as well. And that's true. And that's why we have these contentions at WTO and elsewhere. But that doesn't. The fact is, if we all were protective, we would have less trade, less growth, and more unemployment, more poverty. That's also true. It's how you agree on these things, I think. There's also the inherited structures, the ideas of, we have fetishized the idea of Zuckermans and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's, but in fact, the wealthiest aren't like that. The wealthiest, the 62, most of them are not the popular myth entrepreneurs, rags to riches stories. They've inherited their wealth. And I think if Oxfam's serious about tackling the huge gulf of inequality, then we have to look at something about inherited assets. So not just property, but stocks and shares as well. Is it right that we have to that they are taxed very lightly compared to the middle classes, for example? I think those are the issues, as well as closing down tax havens, the collective response by governments in a global capital world. There needs to be an equal and opposite global political and policy response. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere.
You made one of those points was really interesting, which I want to take to Jyrki now. You've spoken about the need for a better minimum wage, for workers to be able to join unions and collective bargaining to improve their lot. But some economists make the point, which Jan makes, that it's not just about taxation and minimum wages, and the problem of wealth concentration has more to do with inheritance laws than tax laws and minimum wage laws, which receive so much more attention. What do you make of that? What do your members make of that?
Well, obviously, there would be a lot to do in terms of legislation, and this is always a question of political will. It's a question of struggle. So it means that those who really want to change the society and address both of the top and the bottom, they have to win elections and also to find allies, those who care for the worries, concerns of the working people and of the poor people. And I have to say that we have to put this into a wider perspective, that governments who don't listen to the people, because 80-90% of the people, they say that they want to have good education, they want to have a protection against unemployment, health insurances. The people will change the governments. We've seen what has happened recently in Venezuela, in Argentina, elsewhere. What I'm afraid of, that if people lose hope, it's not only a personal tragedy, but it can lead to radicalization. So it's in the interest of governments, it's the interest of business and of labor to build societies that are more equal and built on social justice.
All right, leading to radicalization. John, the people will change the government, Jyrki said a moment ago, but didn't we see that in places like Greece? And what happened at the end of the day? The opponents of the neoliberal model would say that the people's choice was stolen. Are we in a situation now where, if we try to analyse the implications of the wealth gap, is it also leading to disempowerment and disenfranchisation of people?
Absolutely, and I think the example of Greece is a perfect example. You had the people of Greece rising up and saying quite clearly, no, we do not want to have this horrific austerity, this brutal program visited upon us. And what was the response of the European Commission? Well, the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said, you can't have that type of choice. Under the European Union treaties, you don't get the democratic choice to say no. And I think that's part of the problem. We're now seeing the lack of any popular power, any popular participation in any of these decisions. And that's when we look back to our politicians. The European Union, for example, is a key player in this. It is powerful enough to be able to say that it wants to take a stand and to give us back the dream of a social Europe. But instead, what it's now doing is it's saying, no, the corporations need to be the ones in controls. The banks need to have completely free hand. And when the banks fail, they should be bailed out by the public.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Hang on, John,
the
because
public who have to
earlier you were
deal
talking
with that.
about the need, to change tax laws, and tax havens need to be addressed. Why should, some might say, the taxman have more access to money if at the end of the day that money doesn't go and trickle down to the poorest in society? It'll go to bail out the big ones.
Absolutely, but the key thing for us about making it a democratic participation is that we say we will pay tax, we are happy to pay tax because we can see what taxes do in our society. They pay for the public services, they pay for everything. But we are not happy with the idea of big business being allowed to get off paying its tax. Now that's when we have to hold our politicians to account. And we're not happy with the European Union getting involved in all of these toxic trade deals like the transatlantic trade and investment partnership or any of the other EU-Japan, EU-China deals. We want a European Union that will serve the people, not just serve big capital.
I'm interested to know, Jan, what do you make of that analysis there, that really the way that things are going are ultimately going to lead to more instability? If people are unhappy with their economic situation as well as their political situation, surely that just leads to instability around the world.
Yeah, I think if you take a historical perspective, there's some truth in that. And I think even the economists and the policymakers attending Davos will have open ears to the idea that inequality is actually bad for growth, and it's demonstrated it to be such. And inequality has to be tackled if we want better growth. And we have to ask the richest to know whether they actually want to live in poor countries. That's also an argument. Many rich people don't want to live in a poor country with all this grinding poverty everywhere. And you can have a happy union, and it is a lot of it's down to taxes. I think tax evasion. I think most people would accept and understand and support the idea that if you make money in a country, you're benefiting from that public investment in education, health of your workers, the infrastructure, the roads and railways and so on. And therefore you should pay the taxes in that country. And it's wrong that you should take your profits and move them to a low tax haven or a country with low taxes.
Yeah, but yeah, what if the
tax
taxman is not distributing that money correctly? I mean, does one have to revisit the whole model of economics rather than arguing about how much tax money the taxman's allowed to grab?
Yeah. It's a fair point. One thing is about making sure people pay their taxes that they legally have to pay. You can't assume that money is going to be well spent. It could end up as in corruption, or it can end up. But that's where democracy comes in, and good governance. Good governance is about transparency, accountability, and democracy decides on the priorities of where to spend public money. So yes, it has to work well with good governance and democracy.
Jyrki, an interesting point was made by people who were interviewed attending all kinds of rallies which had on the surface of it nothing to do with economic concerns, like the Pegida rallies in Europe or in Germany last year. And people who were attending those said they simply don't trust politicians. When you speak to your grassroots people, do you hear that sentiment echoed? And are you concerned for where that sentiment might go?
Absolutely. We see this in a number of countries around the world in different format, and it's very important now for the political system to regain the trust that they represent the people. And if 80-90% of the world's population say what they want, that they want to have a proper social security, they want to have good quality jobs instead of precarious jobs, then that is what the politicians should give them. Otherwise, governments change. But we have to believe in democracy, but that's why it's so important that this fight for human rights and democracy, that it continues, because that's where everything starts.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's hope for a better world as we thank our guests, John Hilary, Jyrki, Raina and Jan Randolph. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.